So he had this unbelievable voice, high tenor.
He always had the best grass, he always had the best coke, he always had the best looking women. They were always naked. And Crosby was king of the castle.
He was like a little boy that needed to be spanked often.
He still sings like an angel, just like an angel that's been to hell.
It's a great story, it's a great triumph, and it teaches me and everyone else not to write anybody off.
I mean, I would have liked to have kept it, you know, it's no one's business, but it's America and we're famous and everybody wants to know everything.
It was just great for me to find out what a rich life he's led and is leading.
Nothing to lose.
Leads you to where you are today.
I believe in storytelling.
It's gonna make you a star.
I'm still trying to figure that out.
Biography.
In Hollywood in the 1940s, the film business was flourishing, attracting all kinds of talent before and behind the camera. David Van Cortlandt Crosby was born August 14, 1941 in Los Angeles to a gifted cinematographer, Floyd Crosby, and a classical music-loving mother, Aleph.
My parents played music in our house constantly when I was a little kid, and because my dad made movies, we thought TV was a bad thing. I guess they hadn't figured out that they could play movies on TV yet. So we used to sing. We were actually did these things where we would sit around as a family and sing. And they tell me that I started singing harmony when I was about 6. But I've always loved music. It just rang my bell, big time.
David's older brother played the guitar, and their father played the mandolin, while David and his mother sang. Floyd Crosby had won one of the first Academy Awards for his photography on the silent film Taboo, and would win a Golden Globe for High Noon. But his real passion was not at home in Hollywood. It was in shooting documentaries and traveling the world.
He was an absentee father, which I think was difficult for his boys because he took pictures that went out of the country.
As a result, the marriage was strained. In 1950, the family moved to a suburb of Santa Barbara, and by the time David began high school at the exclusive Kate boarding school, his parents had separated and would divorce bitterly. Teenage David Crosby did not fit in easily with the other prep school boys at Kate.
I think it's safe to say that David and I, to a certain extent, were the odd men out, and we were just not an awful lot like the other kids. We were different. We were short. We were picked on. We were teased a lot, made fun of. David and I weren't particularly good athletes, and but we were smart.
David read insatiably. He loved history and science fiction, but his grades were terrible.
David didn't believe in doing homework, but there was nothing wrong with his mind. The guy was incredibly intelligent. But fun for us was the idea of, why don't we sit down and write a book? And he and I started writing a World War II novel on the invasion at Anzio, you know. I didn't know anything about this, but David knew all about it, so we started writing this novel together. I mean David was a brilliant kid.
David shined in non-academic activities, if he was interested. He loved the sailing club and the glee club. And the boys at school would discover David's natural talents when he sang the lead in a school musical, Cotton Capers.
Dear Mr. Lonely Heart, I've borrowed something old. It's trimmed with blue and gold and something new.
I think in that performance demonstrated his talent and shocked the boys in the school who had no idea who he was, had never given him the time of day, and suddenly he's singing, and my God, he's good, and it blew them away. And when you hear the applause at the end of his solo, his first solo, it just raised the roof, and you went right into an encore. I mean, it was incredible. Just incredible.
Girls weren't chasing David yet, but he had already developed his own fascination with them.
He had this incredible incredibly fertile imagination. David had this uncanny ability to tell stories. Now you take 5, 6, 7, 8 pubescent teenage boys and you put them in a circle, and then you put David Crosby in with the mix and let him start telling them stories. And pretty soon you have 6, 7, 8 of the horniest little teenage boys you ever want to know. And David could spin the yarn right off the top of his head. And all these little boys just going, crazy. Incredible, incredible ability.
But because those abilities never went into classwork, David was asked not to return to that school the next year. It was a tough time. His father had remarried, and his mother was angry and unhappy and unable to discipline David. He finally finished high school by correspondence, but only took a few classes at Santa Barbara Community College before dropping out to make music. David's older brother, Ethan, taught him to play the guitar, and mainly as a means to meeting girls, he started singing and playing folk songs in beatnik coffee houses. David did meet girls, and there were consequences. He got one girlfriend pregnant, but unwilling to become a father at age 20, he left town. Traveling and singing with his brother in the folk clubs popping up everywhere in the early 60s, David and Ethan would sing with anyone who paid them, and signed on with a commercial folk group, Les Baxter and the Balladeers.
I mean, the music was good, but the little red bellboy jackets, at that point we would have played in a dress in order to get money to eat. We were little starving folkies, and we did whatever we had to do.
Then came the British invasion. Not only did the music upend the folk scene, but everyone in it suddenly wanted to look, sing, and be a Beatle, including David Crosby. He cut his hair in a bowl cut and started performing solo at amateur nights at the legendary Troubadour Club in Los Angeles.
I remember David would come in late, and you'd come in and you'd get on a list. You'd sign up to be called on stage. And David would march in there. Back then we knew there was trouble brewing. He would march in and demand to be put on immediately. So that's my first encounter with him.
In 1964, the cocky young David Crosby met Roger McGuinn, Chris Hillman, Gene Clark, and Michael Clark at the Troubadour. He was looking for others to sing harmony with and to play the new electric sound. The 5 former folk singers bought new instruments and named themselves the Byrds.
I got an electric guitar that had a strap on it. I didn't know how to play standing up. Didn't know what that was about. I'd always been sitting down on a stool or something playing. And if you had seen me the first time I had an electric guitar going, looking around, trying to figure out where to wear it, how to look.
But there was nothing awkward about the harmony the Byrds could produce when David Crosby added his voice to the blend.
He brought this beautiful voice. He had this unbelievable voice, high tenor.
I think David is kind of a harmony junkie, he loves harmony, and he very often will sing that part, that's sort of the zinger part, It's not the melody, and it's not the harmony just above the melody, but it's kind of the low part, the one that's, that really makes it work.
The group electrified the crowds on Sunset Strip with their unique blend of folk harmonies and amplified rock. The Byrds became so popular so fast with their new California sound that they soon had a record contract. Their first single was an electric cover of Bob Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man, transformed by David's haunting harmony.
Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. I'm not sleepy and there ain't no place I'm going to.
We were driving along and had the radio cranked up, and KRLA played Tambourine Man twice in a row. They played it and then they played it again. And we just freaked out. We couldn't believe it. We stopped the car, we got out of the car, we were like jumping around like fools. It was good.
And radio stations kept on playing Mr. Tambourine Man, pushing it to the top of the charts in 1965. No American rock group had hit this big so fast at just the right moment. At age 24, David Crosby was an authentic rock star in just his first famous band. By 1965, 24-year-old David Crosby and the Byrds were all over rock and roll radio with Mr. Tambourine Man and their unique folk rock sound. Riding on more hits like 8 Miles High and Turn, 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 which was the Byrds' biggest selling single ever, the Byrds' harmonies were transforming rock and roll, introducing the chords of jazz and elevating pop to art. The new style was reflected in the Byrds' appearance. Their Beatles outfits were stolen from their truck and they never replaced them. David Crosby was now sporting Italian hats and a flamboyant leather cape.
He'd come flying down Laurel Canyon Boulevard, and we used to call him Lawrence of Laurel Canyon because that cape would be going, and it was like Lawrence of Arabia had just come out on the screen. It was great.
David's fast approach to life was gaining him a reputation as the bad bird, and he openly extolled the virtues of LSD and marijuana.
And he'd be wearing his Borsalino hat, you know, and this was during the Byrds' times. And I remember this one time he came in with a whole box of bamboo rolling papers, you know, 144 of them, a gross, you know. And he walked through the club sort of like a young prince, you know, handing out these bamboo rolling papers to people.
And he always had the best drugs, and he always had the, you know, the most beautiful girls in his company. And then he was always, you know, I mean, he would breeze through a room wearing some ridiculous, you know, green suede cape, you know, and leave with not one beautiful girl, but 2 or 3 beautiful girls, and sort of sweep them up with him as he left the room.
The Byrds had 2 good years at the top of the charts, but by 1967, Crosby was already clashing with his friends. His strong suit may have been singing harmony, but his personality and ego knew little of that in working relationships. David Crosby was becoming a better songwriter, and he was breaking musical conventions, but the rest of the Byrds weren't always pleased with his innovations. One example was Triad, Crosby's autobiographical song about menage-a-trois relationships and an alternative lifestyle that David really lived for years.
But I don't really see why can't we go three?
No, it was not just a song. Triad is not just a song. It's a well, it happened, and it happened a number of times, and we were, you know, breaking paradigms. We were trying out new ways of being.
He was always the astronaut in his groups. He was always doing the songs that were pushing the envelope, and that was an era when the envelope in rock and roll was being pushed very, very far. So really no one ever got quite as out there as David Crosby did, but he had the musical ability to ground it in something so it never just became, or rarely just became hippie nonsense.
The Byrds were one of the hottest acts at the famed Monterey Pop Concert in 1967, but by then, tensions in the band were running high. Crosby used the occasion to make a political statement from the stage, to the shock and embarrassment of his bandmates.
When President Kennedy was killed, he was not killed by one man. He was shot from a number of different directions by different guns. The story has been suppressed. Witnesses have been killed. And this is your country, ladies and gentlemen.
Embarrassing. I don't think it was appropriate Monterey to start doing that. We're up there to do some music. And to start ranting on the Warren Commission or this or that, it was ludicrous. Come on, you know. People are going, what? What's he doing? I want to hear the song.
Change was in the air, and soon thereafter, McGuinn and Hillman told Crosby he was out of the Byrds and that they'd be better off without him.
Well, we drove up and told him he was fired. We can't work with you anymore. We drove to his house and our Porsches and jumped out of the, I had to put the Porsche in. We jumped out of the Porsches and said, I'm sorry, we can't work with you anymore, it's not comfortable. That's it.
Crosby cashed out of his Byrds contract and invested in a 60-foot schooner, the Mayan, which became his songwriting sanctuary at sea. And Crosby kept singing in the backyards of friends. He blended beautifully with Buffalo Springfield's Stephen Stills and Englishman Graham Nash of the Hollies. The three gifted songwriters instantaneously discovered that their voices added up to much more than the sum of their parts.
They sang this song, Tupac, You Don't Have to Cry. I asked them to sing it again. They looked at each other, they sang it again. I said, okay, do me a favor, one more time, just sing it again. They sang it again, and the third time I put my harmony on, and that was when CSM was born. You don't have to
cry. Crosby never looked back. In 1969, Crosby, Stills, and Nash released their debut album. That same year, they performed in front of 500,000 people at Woodstock and were joined for the first time by Neil Young. Though everyone had heard their album, they had only performed together once before an audience.
Crosby, Stills, and Nash could sit down and play you, sing you, the whole first album in your living room, anytime, anywhere. We did it repeatedly. And so we knew how to sing like that. All you had to do was put mics in front of us, and we could do it. Our biggest problem there was there was 500,000 people in front of us.
The pressure to perform was intense, but they pulled it off beautifully.
It was like absolutely gorgeous. It was just euphonious. I mean, it was a beautiful performance.
Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young were soon known as one of the first supergroups, though they always insisted they were anything but. They saw themselves as individual artists free to pursue their own careers who would play together when the time was right.
You know, that's why they sort of named themselves like a law firm, the firm of Crosby, Stills, and Nash, because each of them could create what they wanted to create and then somehow put it together and it made sense.
The band went on super tours, playing huge stadiums that had never featured rock groups before. No one enjoyed the trappings of success more than David Crosby.
He always had the best grass, he always had the best coke, he always had the best looking women. They were always naked, they were always available. I mean, it was insanity, you know, it was really intense. And Crosby was king of the castle.
By 1969, Crosby had tired of the smog in LA and moved north of San Francisco. He bought a home and for the first time made a serious commitment to one woman. She was the lovely Christine Hinton. David had known Christine since she was a teenager, hanging out on Sunset Strip and the president of the Byrds fan club. She was one of the women who inspired David to write Guinevere.
Guinevere had green eyes.
David was happy and deeply in love, but shortly after the couple moved in together, Christine Hinton was killed in a freak car accident as she was taking her cats to the vet and one leapt in her lap. David had to identify her body, and something in him shattered.
I had no equipment to deal with that. I had no idea how to deal with that. That was too strong and it derailed me.
I knew instinctively that if I didn't keep my eye on David, that he might do something drastic because he really loved Christine. And I think it was the first lady that he'd been with where he actually admitted being in love.
He retreated to his beloved schooner, the Mayan, drowning his pain in drink, while Graham Nash kept watch.
We were in the middle of working and we canceled all the work and we went sailing. Well, first of all, we went drinking and we drank our way all the way around the world. That was our drug of choice. It was anesthetic choice of David. You know, he did not want to feel the pain. And I stayed with him constantly, 24 hours a day for several months.
It was a point of no return in David Crosby's spiral into substance abuse. Cocaine and heroin were now added to the mix. But the music still needed David. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young were set to record Deja Vu. Crosby's depression created an intense atmosphere, and after the recording was done, the band fractured, though they did regroup to tour. There were many partings, while Crosby continued to write and play, usually with his closest collaborator and best friend, Graham Nash. Politicized by the social shocks of the late 60s, Stills, Nash, and Young shared Crosby's intense passions, and their music carried the message. When Crosby was devastated by Robert Kennedy's assassination, he wrote the heartbreaking Long Time Gone as his anguished and angry response in music.
It's been a long time coming. It's going to be a long time gone.
And when the students at Kent State were killed in May 1970, an outraged David Crosby showed a tragic Life magazine picture to Neil Young, who turned the anger into music in about an hour. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young rushed to the studio to record Ohio. More songs documenting the social upheaval of the moment established Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young as the political minstrels and poets of a generation. Yet David Crosby's enormous success would be marred by his equally enormous and devastating drug habit, and soon trouble with the law. By 1971, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young would take one of their many breaks from each other and pursue solo careers. David Crosby had plenty of money and plenty of drugs to fuel his solo recording sessions, and the album was titled, appropriately enough, If I Could Only Remember My Name. He dedicated it to the lover who had died just 2 years before, Christine Gale Hinton. Though still grieving for her, David Crosby was never one to be without a woman. He found comfort through the early 70s with Hinton's best friend, Debbie Donovan, another original member of the Byrds fan club. Debbie Donovan moved in with Crosby and took care of him, despite his many other extracurricular relationships. And in March 1976, she bore him a daughter, Donovan Ann. But Crosby imitated his own father's pattern of absenteeism, and the relationship with Debbie crashed shortly thereafter. Heavy cocaine and heroin use were doing nothing to enhance his relationships.
The longer that I got loaded on hard drugs, the more self-centered I got. And a lot of it, you know, got to be purely just hedonism, just how much pleasure can I have? And it wasn't about, you know, loving somebody else. It was just about how much pleasure can I have.
It would only get worse. By 1976, he had developed a hole in his nose from snorting cocaine, but he turned to a new means of delivery, freebase, firing up cocaine by lighting ether and smoking it in a pipe. It is the most devastatingly addictive form of drug abuse there is, and it had him good.
I remember seeing him parked on an off street off of Beverly Boulevard one day in that Mercedes. In the middle of the daytime, I said, "What's David doing there?" And I drive up behind him, and he was hitting that pipe. And I went up and sort of scared him, and he jumped 20 feet, you know, and there he was. And I talked to him for a minute, and he's, you know, parked in the middle of the street in the middle of the day doing that. So I was going, wow.
The same year of 1976, when David Crosby was 35, he encountered a blonde named Jan Dance at a recording studio in Florida.
I walked into a room and there was this girl playing a pinball machine. And she had one hip cocked out to the side in these little tight white pants. And not that that had anything to do with it.
He sang to me in my bedroom. He sang me a song on the edge of my bed. And I fell totally head over heels in love. And then the next morning he took me to the International House of Pancakes. And that was our first date. It was April Fool's Day.
In time, Jan would become his wife, but first the two forged a fool's bond. David would teach Jan to freebase cocaine, and together they entered a decade of addiction. The couple would be as devoted to the drug as to each other. When Crosby went back on tour with Stills and Nash in 1977, he had little control over his performance.
I remember seeing Crosby, Stills, and Nash during the bad years, during the troubles, as we might call them, and it would be pretty pitiful, and the others would try to cover for him. the music was always so good at the core of it that people got through it, and the crowd was rooting for David. In fact, people probably looked the other way.
One night in 1979, Graham Nash realized his friend's drug problem was insurmountable when Crosby stopped a jam session because his cocaine pipe had fallen on the floor.
The pipe fell off the amp and smashed onto the floor, and David stopped the music. He stopped the jam going on, you know, because his pipe had broken. And it was at that moment that I realized that I couldn't help David. I had tried taking more drugs than David. I had tried taking no drugs. I had tried taking as the equal amount. I tried every way in my limited, you know, knowledge of how to deal with this to try and make him understand that I thought he was on the wrong path.
Nothing had ever been more important to David Crosby than the music.
I couldn't do it anymore. I could not make music with David, and I told him that very moment that that was it. And it shocked me that me removing myself from his life and his musical life had no effect. And it was mind-blowing to me, because I thought that I meant more to him than that.
Crosby was now spending everything he had on dope. Nevertheless, Nash remained a friend, quietly paying for Crosby's daughter Donovan to go to school. Nash even went so far as to buy David's music publishing rights before David could sell them for drugs. By May of 1981, Crosby had overdosed repeatedly and suffered several grand mal seizures. His friends knew they needed to act to save his life.
It's very hard to let go. You have to fight for beauty. You have to fight for greatness. You have to fight to keep it in your life. And even though I had tried removing myself from David's life, I still cared about him deeply, and I still did not want the world to lose David Crosby.
A classic intervention took place when a group that included Graham Nash and Jackson Brown surprised Crosby at his home north of San Francisco to persuade him to fly to LA to a rehab hospital. He took it calmly, then went into the bathroom and lit up his pipe.
I rented an airplane because he was so in such bad shape he couldn't travel in public transport. We had to even promise him that he could go on getting high up until the time he walked into the hospital, and he did, you know, and so there he was, you know, smoking a crack pipe in a small plane. I mean, you know, it was a dangerous thing to do.
David stayed in the hospital for one night, then checked himself out the next day and slipped deeper into addiction with Jan.
And I went to do photos for Rolling Stone up to his house in Mill Valley in about '82. And it was right in the middle of his freebasing time. And gee, he just looked horrible, you know. He had sores, open sores on his arms and on his face, you know, and his girlfriend Jan did too. They looked like death warmed over. They looked like skeletons, you know. I mean, David still had a little meat on his bones, but they just were, you know, real bad shape.
One side effect of Crosby's addiction was severe paranoia. Although he had always loved guns, now he never went anywhere without them.
Carrying a handgun, that's really part of the cocaine psychosis. There's no justification for it at all. When you do a lot of cocaine, you get very paranoid. And you think they, those are quotation marks, are out to get you. And I did. And I used to carry a gun. And I'm very lucky that I didn't wind up shooting somebody with it.
In 1982, he was arrested in California for the first time for weapons and narcotics possession after nodding off at the wheel on his way to a No Nukes concert. He was arrested 2 more times that year, served 5 months on the Texas charges, and failed again at rehab.
And I went down to Dallas to get David out of jail the first time. The first thing I did was take him to go eat a steak, because I knew David would like that. So we went to this great steakhouse. He had a great steak. We got on a plane, flew back to Los Angeles, and he went straight to his dealer. That was disappointing. It was expected, but not quite so soon.
Drug addiction did not quench Crosby's passion for social change. and he did manage to play the Live Aid benefit for Ethiopian famine relief, despite his own miserable physical condition. Finally, in 1985, the crash came. While on parole in California, he was busted once again after a car accident and charged with possession of drugs and guns. This time, Jan and David went on the lam. He got an outlaw friend to charter a plane to take them to Florida, the plan being to escape the country on his well-loved schooner. They found the Mayan in a condition not unlike theirs, totally in disrepair and far from seaworthy.
I thought I was going to leave the country on my boat. Unfortunately, I hadn't sent any money to take care of the boat for many years, so the boat was trashed. There was no way I could go anywhere. You know, up to that point, I had a strong ego, and I would say, you know, I'll do whatever I want. Hell with you people. And at that point, I said, no, I can't just do whatever I want. This isn't working. I'm going to die.
David left Jan on the boat, and he walked barefoot to a local FBI office and turned himself in.
I went in and said, I think you're looking for me. And they said, who are you? I said, I'm David Crosby. And they said, oh, yeah, we are. Put your hands on the wall.
Do you have any comments for us?
Wish me luck, huh?
Why'd you turn yourself in here?
Seemed like the right thing to do.
At the time my husband was dying, I really think my husband had a certain peace of mind. At least he felt that he would be safe and that maybe he could kick this habit.
By 1985, David Crosby's musical fame had been utterly overshadowed by his notoriety for numerous drug and weapons arrests. When he finally turned himself in, a Texas judge took steps that would save his life.
Well, the judge sort of said, you know, Mr. Crosby, we need to get your attention, and we're going to. We're going to send you down to TDC. That's the Texas Department of Corrections. And they did get my attention. But more importantly, they had locked me up long enough to where I woke up and remembered who I was. And that took a while.
Crosby landed in jail in Texas for 9 months. The good news was that behind bars, he finally underwent detoxification and began his recovery from drugs. David's girlfriend Jan went into rehab at the same time, and both struggled alone to get clean.
And we were, both of us, broken. You know, we were pretty broken spirits, and we just had to stay alive. I could do it for him, and he could do it for me, and that's pretty much what happened.
David played with the prison band and slowly began to write songs again.
I thought he'd probably come out stronger than when he went in, which turned out to be the case, except the food really messed him over, he says. It was the worst food in the universe.
A court overturned Crosby's conviction on appeal, and in 1986, he was released from jail. A deeply changed man greeted his friends.
You know, he walked through the door, and and they didn't warn me he was coming over. And think, God, I finally realized who I was looking at, and I guess Graham says, I said, David, are you in there?
After his release to a halfway house, Crosby made a triumphant return to the stage.
He seemed to have not lost a step. You know, after everything he'd been through, you'd think, well, he screwed his voice up, he's not going to be able to sing, he's not going to be able to think, he's not going to be able to... None of those things happened to David.
David and Jan were both clean and newly committed to surviving and to each other.
After I'd gotten out and we'd been together for probably another year or so, I was awake and I looked over at her and realized I was really in love with her and thought, well, marry her, fool. Right? So you know, every once in a while I have a good idea. That was one of the best.
David and Jan married in a double ceremony where Graham Nash and his wife Susan renewed their vows.
It was a triumph, really, that David had made it back all the way from the darkness all the way to this beautiful sunny wedding day.
But there was still a price to pay for the life he had led. When Crosby, Stills, and Nash reunited for Woodstock '94, he became increasingly exhausted and ill.
He finished the tour amazingly. Some days I remember him being so sick that he would go out and sing, and as soon as he would come off the stage, we would hold him and help him walk back to the dressing room.
David discovered he had had hepatitis C for years, and without a new liver, he would die.
I just wasn't willing to accept the fact that I could do the right thing and that God would then smack me in the head and say, well, you're going to die anyway. I was more scared, because now I wanted to live. Now I was in love with life, you know. Now I didn't want to give it up.
David and Jan had been trying for some time to have a baby, and they had just learned that after arduous fertility treatments, Jan had finally become pregnant. David was put on a waiting list for a liver transplant, but while he waited, he was dying.
We took a little bit of time to go sailing on the Mayan to say goodbye in case that was the end of it. And we were lucky that it wasn't.
His doctor said he had a week to live when a donor match was finally made, and David underwent a successful liver transplant. Just weeks before the operation, David had received stunning news. He had a 32-year-old son, and the son was ready to meet him. The pregnant girlfriend he had run out on in the 1960s had given up his healthy son to a loving adoptive family. Now that grown son had located his birth mother and learned David Crosby was his father. They met for the first time in the hospital where Crosby was recovering.
I tried to kind of put a lot of his anxieties to rest. You know, I think he was worried about me being some angry guy that you know, wanted to know why he wasn't in my life earlier, and there was really none of that.
Didn't want him to not like me. Wanted him to like me. Wanted him to be okay. Wanted him to not. I think I wanted mostly for him not to be mad at me.
We started talking about music and what I was doing, and he asked me, you know, do you like my music? And I said, of course. You know, I grew up listening to that, and that was a big relief, I could tell.
As if David Crosby hadn't lived through enough miracles of late, his long-lost son had more news for him. That very night, Crosby would become a grandfather. James and his wife welcomed their first child, Grace. And 6 months after his liver transplant and meeting James, Crosby was given another gift. Jan gave birth to a healthy boy named Django. As it turned out, David Crosby had more in common than DNA with his older son. James Raymond is an accomplished musician and now plays with his father in Crosby's new band, CPR.
His son and he have a certain musical connection that I don't think they could be faking. I think it's just there. CPR's first record is one of the strongest records David's ever made. And it's wonderful because very few rock performers have ever figured out a way to grow up and not embarrass themselves.
David Crosby's face would stay on the cover of the Rolling Stone, not for crime or drugs or music, but for his obvious talent at something he learned late in life, fatherhood. By the turn of the century, David Crosby had rebuilt his life, been straight for 14 years, and was making up for his missing years with his family. He spent more time with his grown daughter, Donovan, and was determined to be present as a father with Django.
So David was not really there for Donovan, which is one of the wonderful things now that I can see that he is doing with his life in terms of supporting Donovan and also being there for Django. He's there 24 hours a day for Django.
Friends of the happy family discussed their own longing for children with David and Jan.
We're having this long conversation about thinking about starting a family.
You know, we're thinking about doing this sometime, and of course, you know, the difficulties we would have, you know, creating children. And Jan just said, well, what about David?
I thought it was a great idea. You could see that there was love there, and they'd been together a long time, and they were a good, stable relationship. And we were sure that it would work. And, you know, I didn't even hesitate about it. I said, yeah, that would be a great idea.
And in January 2000, rock star Melissa Etheridge and her partner, Julie Cypher, stunned the world when they announced that 58-year-old David Crosby was the father of their 2 children. They had done some medical research which assured them a sperm donation from David would indeed be safe, since he had been clean for so many years. But that was not the deciding factor.
I think that by seeing Jan and David's newborn child, it pretty much erased any doubts I had about David as a father and the genetics of it or whatever. This gorgeous, gorgeous baby, sweet boy, healthy.
The proof is obviously in the pudding. The kids are great kids. That's how you tell, you know.
The story is now a rock and roll footnote, and several months after the announcement, David Crosby was in the news again, this time for the stellar reviews of his music. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young toured the country together for the first time since 1974. David Crosby poured his heart into Teach Your Children Well, and his own experience now tempered his harmonies.
The one they picked is the one you know by.
You would think that the life he led would have destroyed that voice, but he still sings like an angel, just like an angel that's been to hell, and maybe that's a better kind of vocal quality.
He's actually much better singer than he ever was before. He's so much stronger now, and he's an incredibly powerful singer.
David Crosby showed few signs of mellowing in his 50s. Instead, he wrote a book and made a documentary about musicians and social activism called Stand and Be Counted.
What they are is sort of an oral history of activism in this country and sort of a primer on how to do it. You know, you can start in your backyard and make a difference book.
He's a peaceful warrior. He's a peaceful warrior, and he only builds things. He only creates things, and he only makes things matter. He tries to spend every moment doing that.
He's back in possession of his tremendous enthusiasm.
It's been an amazing story that has no signs of quitting.
He's careful what he does with his life. Every day is given to him. He knows that. You know, it's another, he wakes up in the morning, another day. It's pretty great.